Hey, modern world history students. All right, we're progressing on into the First World War, Unit 6, and we've reached section number 9, which is the entry of the United States. And this is something that kids are always curious about because earlier I told you that the United States had begun the war as a neutral country. In other words, we were not in the war, um, and then that we joined the war later. And so people are curious to know why it is that in the end the United States joined the war. And that's the subject we'll tackle in this Ed puzzle. So we're going to start at the top of page 16. In fact, that's exactly where we'll be. We'll just be working in that box. So there was not a lot of naval combat during World War One, to sort of traditional naval combat. Um, you thought that there might be because if you remember, one of the things that sort of triggered the British into forming an alliance against Germany was that Germany had built up its naval power. The Kaiser was determined to have Germany respected around the world, and he believed that the only way to do that was to enhance Germany's naval strength. He had ordered Germany's navy to double in size, big enough to challenge the British Navy. So I think a lot of people were not looking forward to, but curious to see what would happen when the German Navy faced off against the Royal Navy of Britain. And there was really only one major battle where that happened, and it was called the Battle of Jutland. So, Jutland is this peninsula that sticks up out of the top of the northern part of Europe, is where the country of Denmark is located. That's called the Jutland Peninsula. And off the coast of the Jutland Peninsula, the Royal Navy of Britain and the German Navy, the Imperial Navy of Germany, faced off in a battle. And interesting battle. To be truthful, the Germans were outnumbered by the British in this battle, and yet the German naval commanders outmaneuvered and outperformed the British. And as a matter of fact, in this battle, the German ships sank greater tonnage of British ships than the British sank of the German ships. So, in one sense, we say, well, the Germans won the Battle of Jutland. Even though they were slightly outnumbered by the British in this battle, they sank more British ships than the British sank of theirs. So, you say that tactically, it was a victory for the Germans. But here's the thing: although the Kaiser had tried to build up the German Navy very rapidly, it still was not equal in size overall, the overall naval strength of Germany to that of the United Kingdom, Britain. And so, kind of what happened here is, even though the Germans slightly sank more British ships than the British sank of theirs, the British Navy was so large that it just kind of absorbed the loss. And Germany's Navy being smaller, although they lost fewer ships, couldn't really afford the ships that they lost. So I don't know if that makes sense, but you can imagine if I got a nasty flu and ended up in the hospital and I lost 20 pounds, and so I weighed 160 pounds instead of 180. Uh, and my old grandmother, who only weighed 110 pounds, lost 15 pounds. So she drops down to 95. She lost fewer pounds than I did due to the flu, but she's actually in more danger than I am because she couldn't really afford. She was already very thin and frail, couldn't really afford the pounds that she lost. That's kind of how it goes with the Germans here. They actually inflicted greater losses on the British than the British inflicted on them, but the British Navy was so large it could sort of absorb those losses, and the Germans really couldn't afford the losses that they suffered. And so tactically, it was a victory for the Germans, but in the bigger picture, strategic picture, um, it was a sort of a victory for the British, because what that meant is that from this point on, the German Navy, the smaller German Navy, will be kind of locked into what's called the Baltic Sea, which is that sea that runs up through kind of northern Europe. It's where Jutland is located, and the German fleet will be kind of locked into that area and sort of protecting and guarding their ports. Um, and what that also means then is that the British Navy will be able to blockade German ports. So you remember how a blockade works? It's kind of simple. You place your ships in the waters outside of your enemy's ports, and you don't let any ships into or out of those ports. And the idea of a blockade is that you are going to deny your enemy access to trade. So by positioning their ships outside of Germany's ports and not allowing any ships into or out of German ports, the Royal Navy made it impossible for Germany to trade with other countries, or very, very difficult to trade with other countries. They could still trade overland. But, for example, the Germans would have really liked to have been able to trade with the United States. The United States, by this time, was the world's leading industrial power. We had actually surpassed both British and Germany, and we were the leading producer of all manufactured goods, from steel right up to much more sophisticated manufactured goods. And the Germans would have been very happy to trade with the United States and be able to purchase war materials from American manufacturers. But because of the British naval blockade, they couldn't do that. They couldn't trade overseas with anybody. Their ports were locked down by the Royal Navy. And so the Germans, they would have really liked to have been able to do that to the British. The Germans would have loved to have been able to lock down Britain's ports and deny them the opportunity to trade in the same way that the British were doing to them. They would have liked to have been able to lock down France's ports and deny France the ability to trade in the same way that the British were doing to them. But the German Navy simply did not have the strength. The traditional German Navy, what they call the surface ships, the ships that ride on the surface of the water, just didn't have the strength to do that after the Battle of Jutland, even though Jutland was tactically a victory for them. But what the Germans did have going for them was a new kind of ship, a submarine, which the Germans call a Unterseeboot. Right? I love the German language. It's so easy to understand. It's so linear. A lot of English words are derived from German words because Germanic tribes invaded England and took over England back 1,000+ years ago, and so a lot of our words are very closely related to German words. And in Germany, what they do is they simply take smaller words and attach them together to make longer words. So Untersee boat. Well, there you go. Unterseeboot. Unterseeboot. Under the sea boat. Submarine. Sometimes simply just called U-boats. Actually, the concept of submarine warfare goes all the way back to our War of Independence, where a small hand-cranked semi-submersible boat called the Terrible Turtle actually attached an explosive to a British ship in New York Harbor and detonated it and damaged the British ship. And then similarly, the Confederates created a submarine called the Hunley, again, hand cranked by the men inside to attack Union warships blockading southern ports. But true submarines did not come onto the scene in warfare until World War I. And it was really the Germans who had mastered this. So the way that a submarine works in general is that you have in the submarine, you have what are called ballast tanks. These are large tanks that can either be filled with air or filled with water. And when you want the submarine to dive, you open the valves on the ballast tanks and water rushes in, and then the submarine dives. And when you've reached the depth where you want the submarine to remain, you close the valves and no more water comes in, and the submarine operates at that depth. And then on the other hand, when you want the submarine to surface, you use pumps to force the water out of the ballast tanks. Now they're filled with air, and the submarine comes back to the surface. Submarine has a battery-powered engine and it has a diesel engine as well, kind of like a hybrid car. So when the submarine is on the surface, it uses its diesel engine, and it charges the battery. And then when the submarine is under the surface, it relies on its battery to power the motor that drives it through the water. Now, that's why those submarines could not remain underwater forever, because their battery power would eventually run out. They wouldn't have any battery power to power the motor and propel the submarine through the water. So at some point, these submarines had to surface and run with their diesel engine in order to charge up the battery again. Submarines could attack enemy ships with really one of two weapons. When they were on the surface, submarines had a deck gun. They had a gun, that they could fire shells at enemy ships. And then when they were underwater, a submarine had a limited number of torpedoes, which was like a missile that flies through the water. It's launched into the water. It has a little motor with a propeller that spins, and it goes through the water. It's got an explosive tip. When it strikes an enemy ship, it explodes under the surface, hopefully blowing a big hole in the ship's hull. Water rushes in, and the enemy ship sinks. So submarines have a variety of ways to attack. They generally limited their attacks to cargo ships, ships that were not very heavily armed. And there's a couple reasons for this. Number one, a warship is heavily armored. It has thick armor. It's designed to protect the ship from shells being fired by enemy ships, cannons. And so it's very hard to sink a warship. Even one torpedo probably isn't going to sink an enemy warship, an enemy battleship or cruiser or something like that. Probably not going to have a lot of success there. And you're definitely not going to have any success firing your deck gun at it. The other reason why you don't attack enemy warships with a submarine is submarines do not have thick armor. They can't. Too much thick, heavy armor will prevent the submarine from being able to dive and surface successfully. So submarines rely on being underwater as their primary way of protecting themselves. One hit from a shell from an enemy cannon will sink a submarine because they're not really heavily armored at all. So one hit will sink a submarine and kill its crew. So you don't want to do that. So generally speaking, submarines remained submersed when they were around enemy warships, and they generally only attacked enemy cargo ships. If they could find an enemy cargo ship that was straying along out there in the ocean without any protection, not part of a convoy with naval ships, warships around it, that's when they would attack. And that is how the Germans hoped to kind of even the score against the British. The British Navy, its surface ships, the ships that ride on the surface of the water, had blockaded German ports. What the Germans hoped to do here was do the same thing to the British, but using their submarines. They would use their submarines to disrupt Britain's trade, and French trade as well, because both the British and the French were doing what the Germans couldn't do because of the British naval blockade. The British and the French were able to purchase war materials from the United States, from American companies, American corporations. As I said, the United States was the world's leading producer of manufactured goods by this time. And we had all these big companies that were cranking out everything from steel to weapons, to artillery shells, to blankets and coats and tents and boots, right? All the kinds of things that the British and the French armies needed to carry out their war effort. And so the British and French were taking advantage of the fact that they could trade with the United States. And the United States would have allowed the Germans to trade with us as well. We were a neutral country, which meant that we were not on either side during the war. We were not in the war. And so any country that was able to could have freely been trading with the U.S. and buying products, war materials from our companies. But because of the British naval blockade, only the British and French could do that. So the Germans were desperate to interrupt that flow of war materials from American companies to the British, and they intended to use their submarines to do it. The Germans were careful not to attack American ships. They did not want to upset the United States and bring the United States into the war. So they focused on the ships of enemy countries like Britain and France. However, in 1915, German submarines attacked and sank a ship called the Lusitania. And the Lusitania was different. The Lusitania was a passenger ship. It was a ship that carried passengers across the ocean. It was a British ship, belonged to a British cruise line, and the German submarine attacked it, and it sank. It sank very fast, as you can see here in this headline from the New York Times. It says sinks in 15 minutes. It was torpedoed by a German submarine off the coast of Ireland, but it sinks in 15 minutes. Well, I think 20 minutes is more like it, but that's very fast. If you know the story of the Titanic, which struck an iceberg 3 years prior to this in 1912, the Titanic had taken several hours to sink, about 4 hours. And the other thing you might remember about the Titanic is that the reason why so many people died when the Titanic sank was that they didn't have enough lifeboats. They believed that the Titanic was designed to be unsinkable, so they didn't have enough lifeboats. There were plenty of lifeboats on board the Lusitania. They had learned the lesson from the Titanic. You had to make sure there's enough lifeboats. The reason why so many people died, you can see probably 1,260 dead. It's probably a little more than that, so almost as many as died on the Titanic. The reason why so many died when the Lusitania sank was that it sank so fast. They couldn't get the lifeboats launched in time. And the reason why the reason why the Lusitania sank so fast is that there were two explosions on board the Lusitania. The first explosion was the explosion from the German torpedo launched by the German submarine. The second explosion was an explosion from the artillery shells that the Lusitania was carrying in its cargo hold, when they then exploded as a secondary explosion. And so two explosions destroyed the Lusitania. One, which was the torpedo explosion, an explosion from outside the ship. The second was an explosion from inside the ship, these artillery shells that the Lusitania was carrying. So the Germans had a reason to target the Lusitania. Now, what you'd say, what's going on here? Well, oftentimes these passenger ships, which had large space in the bottom for cargo, the passengers' cargo, all of that cargo space would not be taken up by the passengers' luggage. So, in order to make money, the cruise lines would sell that additional space to companies that had sold products and were transporting them across the ocean. And this cruise line had sold some of its cargo space to the British government, which had purchased artillery shells from an American company. The Germans had an extensive spy network in the United States, and they were fully aware of this. And that's why the Germans targeted the Lusitania, even though it was a passenger ship. The German government ran advertisements in the New York newspapers. The ship was bound from New York to Liverpool. And the German government ran advertisements in New York newspapers warning Americans not to board the Lusitania, that this was a ship that could be targeted. And most Americans stayed away. Of the 1,300 or so dead on board the Lusitania, only about 10%, about 130 of them, were Americans. Nevertheless, this was quite shocking. Americans were quite shocked by the sinking of the Lusitania, not just because there were 130 Americans killed, but because the Germans had now targeted a passenger ship, not a cargo ship, but a ship full of passengers, and now 1,300 civilians had been killed. So there was a sort of a spirit of we should go to war with Germany following the sinking of the Lusitania. Prior to that time, the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, had declared the United States neutral in the war for a variety of reasons. Number one, you could see how horrific this war was, the nature of trench warfare and how awful that was, and what an awful impact it had on the lives of soldiers. He didn't want this disruption in the life of the nation, and he believed that it would disrupt our economy. And the American public prior to this time was pretty split. You got a lot of Americans whose family background is British, but you got a lot of Americans whose family background is German. And honestly, a lot of Americans were upset about the British naval blockade and how the British were denying the United States and our companies the right to trade with Germany as well as Britain and France. So there were a whole variety of reasons why we declared ourselves neutral. Now, American public opinion turned very hard against the Germans for sinking the Lusitania. And there were a lot of Americans who believed that we should now declare war on Germany. But Wilson really believed that that would be a bad idea. It's 1915. It was very clear now just how horrific trench warfare was. And so the president hoped to negotiate some sort of agreement with the Germans that would avoid U.S. entry into the war. Shortly thereafter that, the Germans sank another passenger ship, or didn't sink it, but torpedoed another passenger ship called the Sussex. This one had no Americans on board, and as you can see, although the bow of the ship was completely blown off by this German torpedo, this ship actually made it into port. But it was the second time that the Germans had targeted a ship carrying passengers, and it sort of demonstrated this kind of alarming trend that German submarines would now attack passenger ships. But still, President Wilson did not want to go to war. So he was able to negotiate an agreement with the Germans. And that agreement became known as the Sussex Pledge, a pledge by the German government taken after they sank or attacked this second passenger ship, the Sussex. A pledge in which the German government made some promises to President Wilson and the United States. The German government promised, number one, that their submarines would not torpedo any ships from neutral countries like the United States. Right? The German government submarines will not torpedo any ships from any neutral countries. Now, that wouldn't have saved the people on board the Lusitania. That was a British ship. But the pledge also had the British government promising that before they would torpedo any ship, before their submarines would torpedo any ship, the submarines would first surface and give warning, so that the crew of the ship, and if there were any passengers aboard, the passengers would have time to abandon ship, would have time to get in lifeboats and get away before the Germans torpedoed it. Now that sounds pretty insane, but when you think about it, not so much. What was it the Germans were after? Was it the crew and the passengers they wanted to kill? Not really. They wanted to destroy the cargo and stop that cargo from getting through to help the British and French. They wanted to destroy the ship. And so when Wilson demanded that the Germans agree to this, the Germans government, not too reluctantly, said, okay, right? It is the ship and the cargo we want to destroy. We don't particularly want to kill the crew or the passengers. They don't really mean anything in the big picture. So the Germans agreed to what was called the Sussex Pledge. They promised not to sink any neutral ships, and they promised before sinking any ships to surface and give warning so that the crew and any passengers could abandon ship. And this kept the United States out of the war. So the United States did not join the war due to the sinking of the Lusitania. Some people make that mistake. It was another 2 years after the sinking of the Lusitania that we joined the war. For almost 2 years, the Germans stuck to this promise, the Sussex Pledge, which had kept us out of the war. However, as the war progressed, the Germans came to sort of regret making these promises. A couple of things happened. The British and the French governments became smart. They said, okay, if the Germans have promised not to sink any neutral ships, then instead of using our own cargo ships to transport the war materials we're buying from American companies, we will hire American cargo ships and cargo ships from other neutral countries to transport these, because the Germans have promised not to target those. Good move by the British and French, made the Germans angry. And then on the other hand, British and French cargo ships now mounted a gun. They mounted a gun on their decks. They had their own deck gun, and they'd covered up with a tarp. And when a German submarine would surface to give warning that they were about to sink the ship, the crew would run out, uncover the deck gun, and start blasting away at the submarine with their deck gun. And as I mentioned to you before, German submarines and all submarines are not heavily armed. One good hit from a gun will sink a submarine. So the pledge or promise that the Germans had made, the Sussex Pledge to President Wilson, was now kind of backfiring against them for these reasons. And the German military leaders went to the government of Germany, went to the Kaiser and said, listen, you guys made a bad deal here. You guys made it. This is a bad promise. The Sussex Pledge is bad for Germany. We should have never done it. It's backfiring. It's not working. We should go back to resuming what's called unrestricted submarine warfare. So, no restrictions. We can sink any ship, anytime, anywhere without giving warning. And they told the Kaiser and the German government, if you sort of let us take the restrictions off our use of submarines and engage in unrestricted submarine warfare, we will sink so much tonnage of Allied shipping and Allied cargo that it will strangle the British and French war effort. And the war will be over in 6 or 8 months. The British and the French cannot continue the war. They will not be able to continue the war if you let us turn our submarines loose and just start sinking Allied shipping without any restrictions. And the Kaiser and the German government said, well, won't that bring the United States into the war? And the German military leader said, yeah, undoubtedly, it will bring the United States into the war. But the United States maintains a very small army, which was true. The U.S. Army at that time was only 200,000 men. And you guys know, we've seen battles like Verdun and the Somme where there's 1 million casualties almost in those battles. So an army of 200,000 men is not much. So they said the United States will have to recruit an army, they will have to train an army, they will have to send that army across the Atlantic Ocean with our submarines attacking their troop transport ships, and then deploy their army in France. And by that time, we will have won the war. We will end the war. If you let us turn our submarines loose, we will end the war before the United States can truly make a difference. So the German government said, okay, we agree. And Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. They began sinking ships all across the Atlantic Ocean, including American cargo ships. And it was for that reason then that in April of 1917, President Woodrow Wilson went to the U.S. Congress and sought a declaration of war against Germany. It was because Germany had broken the Sussex Pledge, they broke their promises, and they had now resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. So in April of 1917, the U.S. Congress voted to declare war on Germany. Now we were in the war. Now, there was one thing the Germans were right about. It took the United States more than a year to recruit and train and deploy our army, because we declared war in April of 1917, but the first U.S. troops really were not in position to fight the Germans until June of 1918. It took more than a year for us to do that. And in that time, a window will open in which the Germans could win the war. We'll have to get to that later, as we're running a little long. Sorry for that. So I'm going to say goodbye to you. Take care. Hang in there. So long, modern world history students.